So here's some news that would come to no surprise for anyone who is familiar with the PlayStation VR2. Haven't really had a whole lot of new game releases since it launched back in 2023. It's a catch-22. Sony doesn't want to make more games for it and invest more money in it because they're not selling enough units, but people also aren't going to buy it if there aren't any games for it. The original PSVR was successful, but that's because it was a lot cheaper. It had much more support. It had a lot more games. You had such a, at the end of the day, you had a big library for the PlayStation VR, like, relatively speaking. You had a lot of games for it. But the approach they decided to do with the PlayStation VR2, it's pretty much the reason why the Atari 5200 died after the enormous success of the 2600 back in the 1980s. The huge thing that killed it was lack of backwards compatibility, and that's exactly what I think is the number one reason why the PSVR2, why people just don't really see a need to upgrade for it. It's very expensive, $550, and it has much less games compared to the original PSVR, and you can't transfer your pre-existing game library over to the new platform because there is zero backwards compatibility. So if you have the original one, why would you get the new one? There is zero reason to do so. Now, like, another big issue was the fact that you were limited to the PlayStation console. Like, you had to already have a PS5 in order to get the PSVR2. They are changing that. They are coming out with an adapter to allow you to use the PSVR2 on the PC, which is great. But the fact that, this new report's coming out talking about how they're slashing the budget for the PSVR2 when it comes to game development, and, there was another report months ago that I covered that they're pretty much eliminating manufacturing for the PSVR2 because the demand is just not there. No one's buying it. A year after launch, and we already have a limited game development budget by Sony, and manufacturing has been slashed almost completely. It's all but discontinued already. So I think it's safe to say at this point that this system is dead on arrival. VR alone, like, the VR industry alone is already a niche market. It only accounts for about 2% of the revenue that the video game industry brings in. So among all the different sectors, PC, console, mobile, cloud gaming, VR is only 2% of that, which is, just shows just how even if you're like the best-selling VR console, VR system, you're still not really making a whole lot of money. Oculus, or now the Oculus name is dead, they just call it Meta, but specifically the Quest, is doing really well. I think a big factor that contributes to that, though, is like when you go from the Quest 2 to the Quest 3, you already have that backwards compatibility, and you already have a whole bunch of titles that you can play, and the library keeps expanding, and it's not contracting. So I think, yeah, if they had, let's say, a thing where you could play all of your PSVR games with enhancements, because that's another big thing, because the original PSVR was great, but it definitely has not aged well. The performance is not good, runs at 30 FPS, which especially for VR is pretty, not the best experience, I'll just say that. I just don't know what Sony expects. They've released only a very small handful of games since the platform release. They are not really, the indication is that they're not developing any first-party titles for it, so they're relying exclusively on indie developers and third-party developers to pretty much make up the difference. So really, I think the best comparison for the PSVR2 would be the PlayStation Vita, another platform that Sony abandoned pretty quickly because it didn't meet the initial sales expectations. It takes so long for a platform to really get its footing. Even the PlayStation 5 and Series X, which sell really well and, are successful, but 4 years into this current console generation, it doesn't even feel like the generation really got started yet and is still finding its own footing. But I remember the PS Vita, by 2013, there was no more first-party development for the PlayStation Vita, and you were pretty much getting either ports of pre-existing games that were already released on the home consoles. Think of games like the Telltale Walking Dead, Borderlands. There was a whole bunch of them. I think a couple of fighting games too. Like it was like that was the main thing, and also indie games and JRPGs. And I still to this day maintain that the PlayStation Vita was the worst video game system purchase that I ever made, because I bought like a few games for it. I mean, the big thing was the proprietary memory card that you had to pay a fortune in order to get. Like, they didn't just have a regular micro SD or anything like that. It was just ridiculously expensive to get one of those. So I never got one of those, but I also didn't have enough storage to play new games. That was the main reason why I'm like, I already spent $250 on the fucking system. I spent, $60, or I think they're actually $50 for each game, and I bought like 4 or 5 of them. I don't want to put any more money in this thing than I already have to. So I didn't play games because I didn't have enough memory. So that was really the thing that killed it, but also they gave up on it way too quickly. By 2013, it was already pretty much dead. So I see a lot of similarities here with the PlayStation VR2. What can they do to save it? Well, make more games for it. You gotta, initially you're not going to be making money. You're going to be losing money with these things. You're going to be selling these systems at a loss. The games, your sales aren't going to be high initially, but over time you build the platform up. And yeah, there's still a chance that it fails, obviously, but there's no chance of it succeeding if you just expect the system to sell and have no games and no actual compelling reason to buy it in the first place. There are very few game systems throughout all of history that have been great and have had an amazing game library and have just been fantastic, but have been failures. Very, very few of them. I know people talk about the Wii U, but you can't really argue the Wii U because it had a very small library of games. The releases were very sparse, and third-party support was non-existent. There are other systems like the TurboGrafx 16 that are kind of cult favorites, and they had a pretty decent library of games, but the thing that really got to that was just how insanely expensive it was, so no one really was going to buy it outside of the niche hardcore gamer. And you could talk about the Sega Dreamcast, but really what happened there was Sega ran out of money. They lost so much money from the Sega 32X and the Sega CD, the Sega Saturn, 3 major financial disasters back to back to back, that they didn't just need the Dreamcast to sell better than the Saturn and to make more money. They needed it to be a smashing success. They needed to be like PS2 level of success. But the PS2 came out and completely blew it out of the water, and the writing was on the wall at that point. So yeah, I mean, typically, I would say 90 to 95% of the time, if there's a console that has a very large and high quality library of games, is released at a somewhat affordable price that is attainable for most people, it'll do well. But right now, the PlayStation VR2 is failing at both of those things pretty hard. But instead of blaming themselves for the failure of the Vita, they blamed it on smartphones and how people just weren't playing handhelds anymore, which clearly we know today is definitely not the case with the overwhelming success of the Steam Deck and Nintendo Switch and other various handhelds that have been released recently, like these PC handhelds, have been doing incredibly well. So the handheld market's actually been expanding in recent years. So what are they going to blame the failure of the VR2 for? Just how VR isn't profitable? I mean, I've made videos talking about how VR is a little bit overhyped, but it doesn't mean that they can't be successful with this thing if they had those killer apps, if they had system-selling games. That's the entire problem with the VR industry as a whole, is that most of the games are pretty much glorified tech demos and are more like proof of concepts, but they charge like $50, $60 and you're done with the game in like 2 or 3 hours. Very little replayability most of the time. So even if they released more games, are the games actually compelling enough for people to line up and get the system? So VR as a whole is struggling, sure, but I think Sony has its own part to play in the blame for the failure of the VR2 and why it's dead on arrival and has basically no chance at actually succeeding at this point. Let me know in the comments section down below, what do you think about Sony scaling back already on the PSVR2 just a little bit over a year? It was March or April of 2023 that this thing launched, and they're already giving up on it, which to me is absolutely insane. They didn't even really try.